You're listening to the Fan to Fan podcast, and today I'll be talking about Hanna-Barbera cartoons from the 60s and 70s, including Jonny Quest, Space Ghost, Birdman, and more. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan to Fan podcast. This is your host, Bernie Gonzalez. In today's episode of the Fan to Fan podcast, I'll be discussing classic Hanna-Barbera cartoons of the late 60s and 70s. Let's start this episode off with a little history for those unaware or just not born yet. Hanna-Barbera was an animation studio that dominated American television animation for 3 decades, from the 1960s through the 90s. It was founded in 1957 by former MGM animation directors William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, the creators of Tom and Jerry. They popularized the concepts and use of limited animation, an animation technique that does not involve redrawing entire frames, but instead reuses common parts between the frames. So you're reducing the overall number of drawings, which isn't to say Hanna-Barbera lowered the animation quality, but rather they were able to save time and labor and improve the quality of the keyframes. And they were able to do it well for quite some time. For over 30 years, they successfully produced hit cartoons including The Flintstones, Yogi Berra, The Jetsons, Wacky Races, Scooby-Doo, and The Smurfs. For their achievements, Hanna and Barbera together won 7 Academy Awards, 8 Emmy Awards, a Golden Globe Award, and a rightfully earned star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Eventually, Hanna-Barbera's fortunes declined in the mid-'80s when the profitability of Saturday morning cartoons was replaced by weekday afternoon syndication. Hanna-Barbera Studios was purchased by Turner Broadcasting in 1991, who then merged with Time Warner in 1996, and ultimately became a subsidiary of Warner Brothers Animation in 1996. But rather than reviewing the rise and fall of Hanna-Barbera, I wanted to focus on some of the classic Hanna-Barbera cartoons of the late 60s and 70s, and they had a ton. Huckleberry Hound Show, The Quick Draw McGraw Show, Top Cat, The Jetsons, The McGilla Gorilla Show, Adamant Secret Squirrel Show, Josie and the Pussycats, C-Lab 2020, and the list goes on and on. So I'm going to spend this episode selfishly talking about some of the classic Hanna-Barbera shows that I loved as a kid and continue to love as an adult. And there's no better place to start than with Jonny Quest. In 1962, Hanna-Barbera was trying to obtain the rights to Jack Armstrong, a radio serial popular in the early 30s, starring an all-American boy who went on globe-trotting adventures with his uncle. The serial was really a marketing promotion for Wheaties, a radio adventure production strictly created to, get kids to tell their parents to buy boxes and boxes of Wheaties cereal. Hanna-Barbera wasn't able to acquire the rights to Jack Armstrong, so they did the next best thing. They created their own version. Comic book artist Doug Wildley was brought in to create this new concept. Hanna-Barbera refused to give him a created by credit, but Wildley said in 1986 that he and Hanna-Barbera arrived on a based on an idea created by, so that's his official credit on Jonny Quest. Over a 10 to 12 week period in 1962, Wildley combined other popular adventure properties like Doc Savage, Tom Swift, James Bond, Terry and the Pirates to create the now legendary cartoon Jonny Quest, who had working titles including The Saga of Chip Ballou and Quest File 037.
Better get me File 037 and call the airport.
You're calling in Dr. Benton Quest?
Right.
Doug Wildley followed the Jack Armstrong template, starting with the creation of main character Jonny Quest, an 11-year-old boy who had a small white dog named Bandit. Johnny's best friend was Haji. Johnny's father was Dr. Benton Quest, and due to his valuable research, Dr. Quest and his family were assigned a bodyguard/secret agent named Race Bannon. When the group wasn't at their home base in the Florida Keys, specifically on the island of Palm Key, they traveled the globe solving mysteries and facing off against monsters, creatures, robots, spies, and supervillains. The series premiered on ABC on September 18th of 1964 at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on a Friday night in prime time.
Happy Friday to you.
At 7:30, from master animators Hanna-Barbera, This is Jonny Quest, where gripping adventure stories explode to life with blazing realism. Watch as full living animation makes possible a new kind of excitement never before seen on television. You'll travel to exotic places. You'll brave perils plotted by the most diabolical minds of the century. And it will happen every time you enter the incredible world of Jonny Quest. Every week on ABC's Wide World of Entertainment.
Jonny Quest was later moved to Thursday evenings at 7:30 in late December of 1964, switching time slots with The Flintstones. The show was canceled, unfortunately, after one season. The last episode aired on September 9th, 1965, but Jonny Quest remained on air in reruns on Saturday mornings from 67 through 1972. It was also included in NBC's Godzilla Power Hour in 1978. And while some may see it as a product of its time, I think the animation and design hold up incredibly well. Doug Wildley's background as an illustrator on Space Angel with Alex Toth, another legendary artist who will come up later in this episode. Wildley worked on the Saint comic strip, and especially his illustration work on Scientific America, Popular Science, Popular Mechanics, Science Digest, and other future science magazines really comes across in his Jonny Quest designs. He showcased devices such as the snow skimmer and hydrofoils, kind of inventions you might see in the James Bond film Dr. No that was released in 1962, just 2 weeks before Jonny Quest premiered. Jonny Quest also had a wristwatch phone similar to GetSmart's wristband communicator that arguably have both evolved into present-day iWatches. Plus, the design concepts work perfectly with the show's pulp pacing, radio serial action-adventure comic inspirations that were only amplified by the show's bossa nova jazz score by Hoyt Curtin. I also think it's interesting that Jonny Quest revolved around 4 male characters, 2 boys, 2 men, and even a male dog, without a sister or a mother in sight. Johnny's mother isn't mentioned in the cartoon, but they do refer to her in issue 2 of the 1986 Comico Jonny Quest comic book series. Her name was Judith. She died in Paris from an incurable disease when Jonny Quest was still a boy. Her husband, Dr. Benton Quest, is so devastated by the loss of his wife that he's assigned a bodyguard to ensure his safety. There was even a made-for-TV movie titled Johnny's Golden Quest, where they adjusted his mother's death as a mystery caused by Dr. Zim, who's Dr. Quest's arch-nemesis throughout the Jonny Quest animated series. The Real Adventures of Jonny Quest, which aired in the 90s, also expanded on Race Bannon's character by introducing his daughter, breaking up the all-male team. She didn't feature in the original Jonny Quest series, but I think all of these expansions to the Quest universe highlight the popularity of the 60s cartoon. For a series that only ran 26 episodes, it wasn't on air long enough to generate aisles worth of toys or other merchandising tie-ins, but that's never stopped Jonny Quest from gaining quite the cult status. There have been lunchboxes, VHS tape releases, followed by a hard-to-find DVD release of the entire 26-episode series. There have been a few toys, particularly a Jonny Quest 6-inch diorama featuring Jonny Quest with his trusty dog Bandit facing off a vicious pterodactyl. That just happens to sit very proudly on my office shelf. Jonny Quest aired in reruns on Cartoon Network from 92 to 2003. DC Comics released a comic book revival recently of various Hanna-Barbera properties, including Jonny Quest, that brings the Quest gang into the modern day, but with a great respect to its pulp roots. There was a stop-motion recreation of the show's classic title sequence, animated by Roger Evans, that is well worth seeking out online. And the 60s Quest cartoon also inspired another one of my favorite animated series, The Venture Brothers. I'll continue going over some of Hanna-Barbera's 60s and 70s superhero shows in just one second. In the meantime, remember you can find the Fan to Fan podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan to Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN, or on Twitter at Fan to Fan Podcast. I'd love to hear from you, so reach out, send a message, and let me know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
It would be an understatement to say that things were changing in the mid-60s, and Hanna-Barbera had their fair share of change. Jonny Quest was canceled in 1966, and another Hanna-Barbera creation, Peter Potamu, went into syndication. Superhero mania also hit the United States due to the popularity of the '66 Batman TV series starring Adam West. Hanna-Barbera jumped on the trend and made their own wave of superhero cartoons, beginning with Frankenstein Jr. and The Impossibles.
It's Frankenstein Jr. and The Impossibles. Multi-Man, Foil Man, and Fluid Man appearing in great cartoon adventures. See Frankenstein Jr. and The Impossibles.
The cartoon premiered on September 10th, 1966 on CBS. The program contained 2 segments. The first segment was Frankenstein Jr. The cartoon took place in Civic City, where boy scientist Buzz Conroy and his father, Professor Conroy, fought supervillains with the aid of a powerful, heroic robot named Frankenstein Jr. or Frankie. Buzz built Frankie and gave him the ability to fly using jet-propelled boots, and he also shot power beams from his fingers. And although he wore clothes that felt like the Universal Studios Frankenstein monster, Frankenstein design looked very similar to the title character in Gigantor, which was an American adaptation of the black and white anime version of Tetsujin 28 Go. Gigantor premiered in January of '66, so it's very possible his design influenced Frankenstein Jr.'s look. The other segment of the show was completely unrelated to Frankenstein Jr., and that featured The Impossibles, a trio of wisecracking superheroes who pose undercover as a Beatles-esque rock music band. Multi-Man could create identical copies of himself, Coil Man could form into a super springy coil, and Fluid Man transformed his body into, well, any fluid. As a bit of trivia, during the development of the show, the trio were called The Incredibles, but was changed to The Impossibles. The pre-production name was later given to the superhero family from the Disney Pixar movie directed by Brad Bird. Frankenstein Jr. and The Impossibles was canceled in '68 after running for only 18 episodes or 36 segments, but it led the charge for more Hanna-Barbera superheroes, including one of my favorites, Space Ghost.
Adventure in the prehistoric land of the Lost Valley with Dino Boy. Adventure in the world of tomorrow with the Space Ghost. Before your eyes see the fantastic come to life. Stay tuned for Dino Boy and the Space Ghost.
Space Ghost and Dino Boy debuted in 1966, and, like Frankenstein Jr. and The Impossibles, the cartoon was broken up into 2 segments. The first starring Space Ghost, an intergalactic police officer from the Ghost Planet. He had a spaceship named the Phantom Cruiser. Nonetheless, Space Ghost could fly, turn invisible thanks to the Invisible button on his Invisible belt, and could shoot various rays from his wristbands. And various is an understatement. His power bands allowed him to shoot a reversing force ray, destroyer ray, destructo ray, pile driver ray, heat ray, freeze force, heat intensifier ray, sonic vibro ray, a scatter ray, good old-fashioned power rays, antimatter ray, electroshock ray, a battering ram ray, a magnetic ray, and the list goes on and on. He had a communicator that was located in the emblem of his chest plate, and a few allies, human sidekicks Jan and Jace, and their pet monkey, Blip, who would help him in fighting a number of recurring villains, including Moltar, Zorak, and Brak. And where Jonny Quest was created by legendary artist Doug Wildley, Space Ghost was created by legendary artist Alex Toth. Toth worked with a number of comic publishers, including Dell, Warren, Marvel, with DC on titles like Batman and House of Mystery, and with Golden Key Comics on Disney's Zorro. He is also known for his memorable animation designs for Hanna-Barbera throughout the 60s and 70s, including Space Ghost. The other segment that aired with Space Ghost was Dino Boy in the Lost Valley, also created by Alex Toth. Dino Boy is actually Todd, a young boy who parachutes out of a crashing plane with his parents still on board. He lands in an unknown South African valley where dinosaurs, cavemen, and prehistoric mammals somehow survived alongside strange creatures and mossmen and pygmy tribes. When he's attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, Dino Boy is fortunately saved by a caveman named Ugg and his pet brontosaurus, Bronte. The trio become friends and spend their time exploring the dangerous hidden valley. I vividly remember watching the series in syndication before school, and then later on Cartoon Network, and then Boomerang, and now I proudly own them all on DVD. And, well, nothing against Dino Boy, especially since I loved the 70s Land of the Lost series, but I have always been much more fond of Space Ghost than Dino Boy. And when I talk about Space Ghost, I don't mean recent incarnations of Space Ghost, seeing him going coast to coast on cartoons Adult Swim spoof of the late night television shows, or the Space Ghost featured in DC Comics 2004 6-issue miniseries that covered his origin and the tragic circumstances that led to his becoming Space Ghost. For me, before I met Captain America, Spider-Man, Batman, or Superman, Space Ghost was my superhero. I didn't collect comics as a kid, so I didn't know about the adventures going on with the Avengers, the Incredible Hulk, the Legion of Superheroes, or the Justice League of America. Anything happening in comics was on paper. Stories were good enough to keep me entertained, but even the best giant-sized annual couldn't compare to an 8-minute Space Ghost episode. I'll admit that the animation comes off somewhat dated, and the stories are certainly not without a solid measure of camp. But watching the 1966 series lets you see Space Ghost as the superhero he was originally intended to be, and as the hero I saw back when I was, 9 or 10. So it makes sense that I was very excited to see less Bronte the Brontosaurus and more of Hanna-Barbera's future superhero offerings. In 1967, CBS was trying to bulk up their Saturday morning lineup by introducing Midor, Moby Dick, Herculoids, and Shazam. So they created a 6-part episode titled The Council of Doom, where each of these new superheroes was introduced while Space Ghost faced off against some of his more notable villains.
Space Ghost battles the most sinister villains in the universe. Don't miss the new 6-part adventure of Space Ghost, with special appearances by Moby Dick, Midor, Shazam, the Herculoids.
And of these new heroes, Herculoids was by far my favorite. Alex Toth designed and came up with the idea of the Herculoids, who debuted on CBS on September 9th of 1967. The cartoon ran for 18 episodes or 36 segments, but unlike Frankenstein Jr. and the Impossibles or Space Ghost and Dino Boy, both 11-minute long segments belong to the Herculoids.
Somewhere in the future lived the Herculoids. Igu, Gloop, Bleep, Tundro, Zoc, Zandor. Adventure in the future with the Herculoids. Next on most of these stations.
The Herculoids were a family led by Warrior King Zandor, who was voiced by Mike Road, who also voiced Ray Spannon on Jonny Quest. Zandor's wife was named Tara, and she was voiced by Virginia Gregg, who also voiced Norma Bates in Hitchcock's Psycho. And Zandor and Tara also had a young son named Dorno. When trouble arose, Zandor summoned a small army of exotic beasts, starting with Igu, an ape with tough, rock-like skin. Then there was Zoc, a dragon that shot laser beams from his eyes and tail. Tundro was a triceratops that shot flaming rocks from its horn. And Gloop and Gleep were a pair of shape-shifting blobs. The cartoon took place in a prehistoric, futuristic hybrid world populated by alien villains, robots, and creatures with plot lines rooted in science fiction and superheroic adventures. The other new series I was fond of was Mighty Midor. To be completely accurate, the series was titled Moby Dick and Mighty Midor, but like Dino Boy, I didn't care much for the seafaring adventures of 2 teenage boys and their pet dolphin who were rescued by a giant great white whale named Moby Dick. While other kids enjoyed watching them face the dangers of the underworld sea, I was glued to my TV watching Midor.
While on a hunting trip, Tor and his faithful companion Tog rescue an ancient hermit. Grateful, the old man gives Tor a club, which possesses great powers. Tor raises the club, and he becomes Midor, and Tog is transferred into a fire-breathing dragon. Together, they become champions of good and the nemesis of evil.
Alex Toth designed and came up with the idea of Mighty Midor. The series ran for 36 episodes on CBS before it was canceled in September of 1969. Not to be outdone by CBS, NBC jumped on the superhero bandwagon by having Hanna-Barbera create a few superheroes for them, namely Birdman and the Galaxy Trio, created by, you guessed it, Alex Toth. Birdman, or more accurately, debuted on NBC on September 9th, 1967. Ray Randall was an ordinary human endowed by the sun god Ra with the ability to fly, shoot solar rays from his fists, and project solar shields to defend himself against attacks. He was recruited by a top-secret government agency named Internation Security to fight crime. His eye patch wearing contact is Falcon 7, and Birdman was assisted by his trusty Eagle sidekick Avenger. Over the course of 40 episodes, Birdman and Avenger operated out of their inactive volcano headquarters and squared off against the likes of Dr. Millennium, Vulturo, Dr. Shark, and Number One, the leader of the sinister organization Fear, and Birdman's number one enemy. And then there was the Galaxy Trio, 3 extraterrestrial superheroes who patrolled space in their cruiser, the Condor 1. The superpowered trio maintained order and fought evildoers in the name of the Galactic Patrol Law Enforcement Agency. Vaporman had the ability to transform part or all of his body into gaseous form, enabling him to fly and squeeze through very small spaces. He could also produce various forms of vapors, such as freeze vapor from his hands. Gravity Girl had the ability to bend the laws of gravity to her will, allowing her to fly and lift very heavy objects with her mind. And Meteor Man could increase or decrease the size of any part of his body, giving him superhuman strength. For 20 episodes, sandwiched between the Birdman segments, the Galaxy Trio fought the evil forces of Computron, Titan the Titanium Man, Drakmor the Despot, and Krag the Space Pirate. Hands down, some of the greatest supervillain names ever created. I'll conclude my review of Hanna-Barbera 60s and 70s superhero shows in just one second. But in the meantime, if you are listening on iTunes, please take a moment to rate and review. Just search for the Fan to Fan podcast, go under reviews, enter a star rating, or write a review if you have a second or two, and click send. That's how easy it is. I will greatly appreciate it. Thanks. With original characters like Space Ghost and Birdman garnering an audience, Hanna-Barbera tapped into the world of printed heroes for their next production, The Fantastic Four. The cartoon was made for ABC and premiered on September 9th, 1967.
The Fantastic Four, starring Reed Richards, Stu Richards, Johnny Storm, Ben Grimm.
Featuring designs by, yet again, Alex Toth, the cartoon ran for 20 episodes and followed the adventures of Reed Richards as Mr. Fantastic, Susan Storm Richards as the Invisible Girl, Johnny Storm as the Human Torch, and Ben Grimm as the Thing. The superpowered foursome faced off against some of the greatest villains from the Fantastic Four comic book, including the Mole Man, Super Squirrel, Blastar, Atuma, Red Ghost, and Dr. Doom. The show also adapted several of the now classic comic book stories written by Stan Lee and illustrated by Jack Kirby.
Fantastic!
As a bit of a side note, after Disney purchased Marvel in December of 2009, they also received the rights to most of the Marvel cartoons, including the 90s animated series like X-Men, Spider-Man, and Silver Surfer. They also bought the rights to other Marvel cartoons like the 80s Pride of the X-Men and the 60s Spider-Man cartoon series. However, since the 60s Fantastic Four cartoon was produced by Hanna-Barbera, and Hanna-Barbera was then sold to Time Warner, who now owns the 60s Fantastic Four cartoon, and Time Warner happens to own DC Comics, Marvel's biggest comic book competitor, so in a way, DC Comics owns the 60s Fantastic Four cartoon. Who would have thought? And if you're wondering who produced the 60s Spider-Man cartoon, it wasn't Hanna-Barbera. It was actually a studio named Grand Trey Lawrence Animation, and they produced the other 60s Marvel superhero cartoons that ran in 7-minute segments featuring the Incredible Hulk, Thor, Captain America, and Namor the Submariner. The 60s Spider-Man cartoon series premiered on September 9th, back in 1967, on the same day as the Fantastic Four cartoon. And just to give you an idea of how awesome cartoons were in 1967, here's what the Saturday morning lineup looked like on CBS. Frankenstein Jr. and the Impossibles, The Herculoids, Shazam, and Space Ghost. Meanwhile on NBC, you have Samson and Goliath, Birdman, Secret Squirrel, and Top Cat. And on ABC, you have Casper, The Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Journey to the Center of the Earth, King Kong, and George of the Jungle. Talk about the heyday of Saturday morning cartoons.
Saturday morning, September 7th on NBC, a new exciting galaxy of fun, starting with Super 6 and his super sidekicks.
The banana splits are coming.
Top Cat speeds into new and hilarious escapades. The Flintstones. You'll witness the incredible and powerful young Samson. There's high-flying action, too, with Birdman and the Galaxy Trio. Super President springs into action-packed adventure. Saturday morning.
Hanna-Barbera took advantage of the superhero trend and left a legacy that will not be forgotten, and it's really all due to Disney in a way. In their early days, Hanna-Barbera couldn't match Disney's big-budget productions. Disney had shorts and feature-length animated movies like 101 Dalmatians, released in 1961. Then there was 1963's Sword into Stone, let alone all the now classics from the 30s and 40s like Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi. But before televisions became a staple of American life, short cartoons were shown to audiences in movie theaters, and they were traditionally placed before the feature film, along with coming attractions, short subject films, and newsreels. So you'd see 4 to 7 minute long cartoons like Merry Melodies or Betty Boop. So by the time Hanna-Barbera is in what we would now call their golden age, you had the rise and fall of the Fleischer Studios, who made their name with Technicolor Popeye feature films and the Oscar-nominated short series of spectacular Superman cartoons. Then there was Warner Brothers, who, under the supervision of legendary animator Tex Avery, had no intention of competing with Disney, but instead brought a new wacky, zany style of animation to the studio that would increase the Warner Brothers cartoons' popularity in the crowded marketplace with their own Looney Tunes characters. Rather than fight Disney on the big screen or Warner Brothers in the shorts department, Hanna-Barbera hit the airwaves as TV was spreading across the U.S., and they were able to remain competitive and productive by using limited animation, which really gave each show their own style, a style that distinguished the Hanna-Barbera shows from Disney and Warner Brothers, and it allowed them to dominate the TV animated landscape in prime time and on Saturday mornings. And while Saturday mornings are no longer what they were when I was a kid, let alone when my parents were kids, but that was prime viewing real estate for advertisers, created by advertisers, to reach a captive audience of kids with colorful characters going on heroic adventures that were frequently interrupted by commercials for cereals, toys, and, well, everything a growing boy or girl needs in the 60s and 70s, and anything that they may be able to talk their parents into buying for them. And in yet another example of Hanna-Barbera paying attention to pop culture, in 1968, the popularity of the Adam West Batman series died down, so Hanna-Barbera moves on from the superhero trend and ends up producing another wave of classic cartoons, including Wacky Races, Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, Josie and the Pussycats, and the Flintstones. But in 1973, Hanna-Barbera goes back to the superhero well for the Super Friends.
In the great hall of the Justice League, there are assembled the world's 4 greatest heroes, created from the cosmic legends of the universe. Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, Aquaman. Their mission, to fight injustice, to right that which is wrong, and to serve all mankind.
Well before superhero team-ups became standard in movies or TV shows, Super Friends was the first time we saw well-known DC characters like Batman, Robin, The Flash, Superman, and Wonder Woman teaming up in animation against supervillains like Lex Luthor or the Joker. And maybe of more significance, Super Friends introduced a generation of kids to other heroes like Plastic Man, Hawkman, Green Arrow, or Aquaman. And you can't forget the bad guys, Wonder Woman's nemesis Cheetah, or Aquaman's arch-villain Black Manta, characters that may have been well known by avid comic book readers but were receiving an animated coming-out party thanks to Super Friends. This first run of Super Friends was made up of 16 one-hour episodes that were rerun until 1974. They were revived in a number of animated incarnations, including the all-new Super Friends Hour, Challenge of the Super Friends, and The World's Greatest Super Friends. For me, not only was Super Friends another terrific Hanna-Barbera cartoon, it was the grandfather of more recent superhero cartoons like Batman the Animated Series, Superman the Animated Series, Justice League Unlimited, and Marvel's Earth's Mightiest Heroes. Warner Brothers has released the Super Friends cartoon series on DVD in 2 volumes, and speaking of DVD releases, you can also find the complete series for Jonny Quest, Frankenstein Jr. and the Impossibles, Space Ghost and Dino Boy, Herculoids, Birdman and the Galaxy Trio, Moby Dick and Midor as well. Worth noting, on the Space Ghost and Dino Boy DVD, there's a feature titled Simplicity, The Life and Art of Alex Toth. It's a wonderful 80-minute long documentary that delves into the life of the legendary animator. They show photos, rare artwork, interviews with family and friends, interviews with comic and animation artists like Joe Kubert and Paul Pope that all help paint a portrait of Alex Toth as a man, as a father, as an artist, and as an animation great. All right, I could go on and on about other classic Hanna-Barbera cartoons like Adamant, Hong Kong Phooey, or Dynamite, but that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode. Tune in next time for more fan-to-fan conversations on the Fan-to-Fan podcast. Thanks for listening.
The time has come to direct all further attacks against the planet Earth.